it's important for me to inquire about your well-being and your family's well-being, that everybody is fine. I don't know how you guys are dealing with this self-quarantine and this curfew, but I'm hoping that everybody is fine in your end.
We are sort of muddling along like everybody else. Obviously, it takes some getting used to. But so far, so good. We generally are sort of home people, so we are not really having to change lifestyle that much. But obviously, we are having to stay at home much more often than we would, and we are also obviously sort of having to engage and sort of and cope with relatives and other people, extended family, who are sort of in different circumstances. So, yeah, this is unprecedented. I think we are having to do. We used to hear a lot about this, like from my grandparents and some of the older people, about the emergency, you know, the sort of traumatic experiences they went through. Unfortunately, most of those people are gone. So we just have to, I think, learn how to live in this new world.
So let me just first start with the first question. In your view, what does the corona pandemic reveal about the political economy globally, continentally, and locally here in Kenya?
Well, I mean, it's early days. It's very early days, but I think it's already revealing a lot. I think the overlapping political economic theme of the pandemic, I think, is what is development. And Singapore's foreign minister, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, gave in a recent interview with CNBC what I think the parameters of that discourse are going to be after the crisis, or even during the crisis. And let me quote, because I think this is very critical. He said, "This is an acid test of every single country's quality of healthcare, standards of governance, and social capital. And if any of this tripod is weak, it will be exposed quite unmercifully." I think we're already seeing very counterintuitive results of this test vis-a-vis the development conventional wisdom. For example, from where we sit here in what is called the Global South, the huge differences in the health systems of countries we consider equally developed has come as a surprise, especially EU countries. The fact that Germany would seem to have 4 times as much critical care capacity as the UK, that's a big surprise. I've had the British people over the years lamenting underinvestment in the NHS by successive governments, particularly the Conservative governments. But it's not something that I've been able to relate to until now. I really not, and of course you wouldn't, because I don't live there. But I now sort of totally understand seeing this big gap and what it means in the case of a health emergency. So those are some things we are observing. In the US, obviously the very polarized healthcare politics is something that many of us follow, if only peripherally. So the exposure of that will not come as a surprise, but that does not make it much less merciless or unmerciful. Prof. Robert Rich, I don't know whether you remember Robert Rich, he was Clinton administration labor secretary. He opined in The Guardian the other day in an op-ed that the US does not have a public healthcare system at all. And I think the pitfalls of the combination of that exclusionary healthcare system and one of, if not the meanest, I think, labor rights regime certainly in the developed world, has been really laid bare. I think that's the convergence that people do not have health insurance and they don't get time off from work. Yeah. So the incentive for them not to go to be tested, and even if they are feeling unwell, is quite high. I think that sort of convergence is very frightening during this episode, and I think it will come back. I think those are some of the debates that you'll hear. But of course, for the US, I think the most sore point is, of course, in the person of Mr. Donald J. Trump. I read a column, I think, the other day by an Atlantic columnist, Peter Werner, who ruthlessly opines that in this crisis, the president is, and I quote, utterly unsuited to deal with either intellectually or temperamentally. If you follow him on Twitter, you will know what this columnist is talking about. I think 2 or 3 days ago, the Washington Post had an editorial title that Trump has made us #1 in the spread of a deadly disease. So I think those convulsions are already exposing how the sort of political economic dynamic might evolve after the crisis. I think if you look at our side of the planet, it's called the South, but of course it isn't, because the planet is really we are political South. We of course know that our health systems are weak. That has been highlighted quite a lot, and we are now facing the prospects of paying the price of weak health systems. We really pray that we will not. We already have this big black box, that we don't know whether our numbers so far are low because we are not testing, or they are low because they are low. Yesterday or the day before, the Burundi health minister was asked why it is that they don't have confirmed cases in Burundi. And his answer was very clear. He said, the answer is quite simple. We do not have testing kits. That's why they have 0 confirmed cases. So if it turns out that community spread has been going on and monitored, I think we will pay very dearly for this deficiency. We've seen, for instance, South Africa, which has a fair amount of healthcare capacity, ramp up its testing and discovering the extent of the pandemic in a very short time. I think no other sub-Saharan African country, no other African country has actually been able to do that. So that I think is something we are going to be discussing a lot in terms of our priorities, and I'll come back to that at some point. The other thing which I think is insightful and hasn't been remarked on much, is that this virus has turned the public health class dynamics on its head. Generally, the infectious diseases spread from the slums to the suburb, if I may put it that way. And now we have a situation which is the opposite. They're spreading from the suburbs to the slums. I came across something on social media. It's attributed to an Indian doctor. I don't know whether it's an Indian doctor, but it's amazing the way he put it. I don't think it can be improved on. And I would like to sort of quote it. He said, social distancing is a privilege. It means you live in a house large enough to practice it. Hand washing is a privilege too. It means you have running water. Hand sanitizers are a privilege. It means you have money to buy them. Lockdowns are a privilege as well. Lockdowns are a privilege. Just a second. It means you can afford to be at home. Most of the ways to ward the corona off are accessible only to the affluent. In essence, a disease that was spread by the rich as they flew around will now kill millions of the poor, end of quote. I certainly hope that it will not come to killing millions. But regardless, the fact that the poor are bearing the brunt is matter that actually we can expect to be revisited, if I may use one of our political vernaculars. When this is over, we're going to say, all the time you've seen sort of the poor being the cholera, infectious diseases, all manner of things. Now, the jet-setting crowd is the one which is bringing diseases to a very vulnerable poor people for who they have not provided adequate health care. And then they are telling them to lock down or to social distance in circumstances that is actually a practical joke. So I think those sort of those dynamics are going to be quite intense points of debate, I think, when this is over. What else?
So then, quick one. I mean, what do you think will be the effects of Corona moving forward in the socio-political economy in the world? I mean, there are debates currently where people are talking about BC and AC, before Corona and after Corona, where this will always be seen as a drastic change with how the world sees itself. So, what are some of these things that you see moving forward will take place?
I mean, I keep having to say that it's early days yet, and it's early days. But the thing which is for sure is that it has more or less stopped the global economy on its tracks. And I think this is unprecedented in peacetime. This is stuff we read about World War II. We saw a bit of it in the early 90s. I forget, was it 91? Following the outbreak of the first Gulf War. We saw a bit of that level of disruption, but it did not last long. It went back to normal. Again, that was unprecedented, that kind of war. Obviously, the big unknown here also is how the pandemic will unfold. I think best case scenario is another month. Best case scenario. That is, normalcy might begin to return in May. The worst case scenario is if, as it seems, there is a weather factor in the spread, then it might play out like the Spanish influenza of the last century, 100 years ago, where it will go down in the northern summer and then returns in the winter with a vengeance. And then we have another cycle of that until the whole world achieves this thing being called herd immunity. We are now becoming, all of us are becoming amateur epidemiologists because we have to learn these terminologies that are being used. How that plays out, of course, whether it's short-term or medium-term or long-term, there's a medium-term in between, probably maybe 6 months, and that's, I think, the more likely scenario. Obviously depends on the socioeconomic structure of different regions and different countries. I think in the best case scenario, where it sort of we begin to see normalcy in May, June, in a couple of months, the advanced Western countries will be the hardest hit economically because they're the hardest hit with the disease right now. But they also have the strongest shock absorbers economically and socially in terms of financial resources and welfare systems that can support people during the crisis. But if the numbers remain as low as they are now in the poor countries, that is, we don't get that, so that our numbers are really what they are, not a reflection of just lack of testing, and we have maybe thousands of infections already. If they remain low, then we might actually dodge the pandemic bullet. That's what we hope. But I think quite a few will be very hard hit economically, because the economic impact is not sort of the same level. It's not being driven by the pandemic, but it's being driven by fear. So that it's asymmetric. It's an asymmetric shock, because for us to stop the pandemic, we have to disrupt the economy. Yeah. So in a way, if I use that language, the pandemic is behaving like a terrorist. You do a little sort of damage, but cause maximum fear. Although I'm not saying the damage is little, but clearly, if you look at the fact that for you to, if as a country, to minimize or to evade the pandemic, you have to lock down completely. If you lock down completely, then you have shut down your economy. That's what I mean. Now, the problem is that quite a lot of our countries don't have both the financial resources and the state capacity to deal with this. So there are a couple of fragile regimes that were already tottering on the edge of collapse. Places like Togo, where you've been having political upheaval, places like Sudan, which haven't even begun to recover from the revolution, If places like that, places like Libya, of course, it has never stabilized for many years. So fragile states, basically. If those get heavily hit, I think you might see them again getting sort of tumbling over. On the whole, it's looking like Asia might come out ahead because Asia seems to have more of the Dr. Balakrishnan's tripod seems to be stronger in Asia than elsewhere. But on the other hand, there might be an economic blowback, I think, because although global pandemic scenarios of this kind have been predicted for a while, Bill Gates did so about 3 years ago. What this has done is crystallize and bring home the message to the global supply chains about the risks of geographical concentration of sourcing and location of economic activity in one place, particularly China. So as that begins to pan out, I think you might expect, or you should expect, that will be reevaluated, and then that might actually be a blowback on China, that big business, particularly global multinationals, may want to diversify where they source things from, because these pandemics we hear, this is just the beginning. Yeah. They are really not, this is the beginning. They are not going anywhere. They have been predicted. Or not just pandemics, but even climate change sort of events. I think what this has done is bring home the message that it is possible to have catastrophic global events. And therefore people will begin to look at those risks. Yeah.
Which brings me actually to the next question. I mean, you've talked about climate change, but in the same vein, there's a likelihood of countries becoming more nationalistic in their outlook to the globe. But how then how then will it be possible in a space where very many of the challenges in the 21st century will need global cooperation, and yet the pandemic and previously debates around going back to nationalism in the nation state, how will that play out?
No, I think it's not either or. You're probably going to see more economic nationalism. I think the US was already beginning to move in that direction. And I think this will give that sort of thing a little more, or a lot more impetus, actually. You're going to see countries deciding that there are certain strategic industries that they should have a certain degree of domestic self-sufficiency. I think health commodities, for instance, you can already see that people are going to have a certain capacity to scale up the production of health commodities to deal with this kind of eventualities. That gives that case just got a big boost. Food. I think you're going to see food nationalism also. People are going to think about that. But on the other hand, it also underlines the importance of global public goods. Yeah, and control of pandemics is a global public good. And the interconnectedness linked to global public goods like global warming, whether you're talking about sort of negative externalities or positive public goods. So it is possible to have both economic, which is sort of more focused on trade, but at the same time, stronger impetus on cooperation in the sphere of common interests like global public goods. Because it is not, what has happened is in this sort of globalization has been dominated so much by trade and wealth and finance and probably neoliberalism, if you want to put that word. But there are many, many other aspects of global interdependency that have been subsumed and have not been given short shrift by this overly economic and financial focus. So what we might see is the economic and financial being downplayed, and the other interdependencies, particularly those related to nature, becoming more
More
salient.
pronounced, more
Yeah,
salient.
more pronounced, which is a good thing, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So let me just bring you now locally. Recently, you wrote a public letter to the president, and there were two ideas in this public letter that raised quite a bit of uproar and debate on social media and other platforms. Could you elaborate on this idea of moratorium and the lifeline fund? Sorry, very clearly for our audience, because these were two that I will be seeing on social media, sparking quite a bit of debate, both for and against these two policy remedies.
It's a big challenge for the following reason. The substance of that letter is deceptively simple, because it makes a layman think they understand the underlying principles, because it's written in sort of plain language, while in fact it is conceptually quite technical. Yeah, so I hope I can be able to elaborate. The letter itself actually emanates from it. It's actually encapsulated in a very simple comment, in a very short comment I made in response to my friend William Mohammed. He's a fellow sort of finance economics guru out in Saudi Arabia. He made the observation that central banks' anti-recession arsenal was now exhausted, and they have to innovate or improvise. I won't go into the details. And my comment was just to affirm what he said. I would like to sort of quote from it and then elaborate. Was the following statement. I said that demand management tools are not fit for purpose in this coronavirus episode. And then I opined that in addition to financial relief, governments should consider a lifeline facility to keep workers on payroll. And depending on how long this goes, governments should start thinking in terms of wartime economic management, which means sort of central coordination of the economy. Now, let me elaborate. We have two standard policy instruments to fight recessions, and I think these are quite well known by people in terms of name, if not the substance, namely fiscal policy, which is deficit financed public works. That's the way you usually do it, and monetary policy. And monetary policy is simply central banks injecting money into the banking system. Now, both these things work by stimulating economic activity, and that requires people to be up and about. Yeah, people have to be busy. Now, but disrupting this virus requires the opposite. It requires that we stay indoors and minimize the kind of contact that economic activity requires. So you cannot use the instruments that require people to be up and about and busy to deal with the economic shock that or pandemic and the economic shock, where the health side requires people to stay indoors. So what's going to happen? Business and people will lose incomes. Businesses that have debt may not be able to service them, and people without incomes might go hungry. So you begin to ask yourself, how do you deal with this? It's not the same. It's not business as usual. Yeah, it's not business as usual. I saw, I think today or yesterday, that Serena, the hotel chain, has closed 10 establishments, 10 of its lodges until July. In my local shopping mall, I wrote that a few days ago, all businesses other than the supermarket, I think the food outlets and the pharmacy, they've closed until further notice. Yeah. A friend of mine just sent me a message this morning saying that he has had to let, very sadly, he's had to let go 14 of his 25 sort of staff, employees, and he doesn't know how long he will be able to keep the remaining 9. Now, that we already know, and we can see that. But lowering interest rates is not going to help you. Trying to get government to spend is not going to help you. You have to procure, you have to do all the manner of things to do public work. So, but two imperatives are clearly apparent. One, you need to cut business some slack so that banks don't foreclose on their loans if they fall behind on payments. But then if businesses don't pay and people don't pay their loans, banks may fail. So again, central bank needs to cut banks some slack, and also give them some liquidity, sort of lifelines. So that's the part I'm calling financial relief. And we've already seen the central banks, ours included, and others actually already doing that. Now, my lifeline fund proposal is actually a workaround. The difficulty that social distancing and lockdowns and those kind of things, the fact that they effectively kill fiscal and monetary policy, stimulating the economy, other than that financial relief part that I have talked about. So essentially, it's a hybrid of three things. You take a fiscal stimulus, as you would do it, but it doesn't make sense to use it for public works, for the reasons I have said. And then you inject it into the financial system, as you would a monetary stimulus. But instead of leaving them to the market for the supply response, as you would, you then channel that and basically try and see how you can now make sure that there is an uptick. There's uptick of that sort of money and instrument using sort of business and social protection sort of needs. So you take this need and you make it to serve an economic stimulus purpose. It's very different. It's subtle, but it's a bit different from the way people are looking at it, as if it's a purely welfareist intervention. It isn't. Yeah? It will do that, but it does not preclude other social safety nets. But the first question I was asking myself is, how would you deliver? How do you deliver an economic stimulus in the time of Corona, as opposed to during a normal economic shock? And I think many of the people who are talking about this haven't understood it, because they probably don't understand economic management, macroeconomic management that well. Now, why you're doing that, the fact is you're actually not going to stimulate much economic activity. What you're really doing is damage control. You're doing damage control to prevent the economy from nosediving and complicating things much more. Because if you are trying to deal with a pandemic and then your economy goes into nosedive, even your capacity to pay for the medical commodities and other costs of the pandemic, if your banks start to fail, your state capacity to deal with the pandemic itself will be undermined. So what you're trying to do is put a floor. On how far the economy will fall, because the economy will fall. But if you just to use your normal incentives like a tax break and interest rate break and those kind of things, in a time of such great uncertainty, the supply response will be extremely low. Okay, now I'm getting technical. But that's the point, that the Lifeline Fund is a macroeconomic response. But because it assumes the face and the shape of a safety net, people have gone straight ahead to look at it as a safety net without welfare sort of thing, without understanding the macroeconomic need, which is the primary objective. Which is why I've also said, if you read the letter, the last point, the last bullet point, is very clear that in addition to the Lifeline, which is supporting business and trying to protect jobs, we may need a community-based safety net. Why? Because we don't have the kind of welfare system that is household or individual based that the West have, where you can sort of target households directly. We have no way of targeting households, like we don't have an employment insurance and all that stuff. And if you try and use the state system, we know ourselves, it's completely corrupt. That money will be diverted. what I think we can do, and I think our best bet, is to leverage on community social capital. You decide the unit. My proposed unit is a ward. And then you say, this is the unit that we will ask people to organize themselves, set up a simple accountability mechanism, have a governance structure, decide how much money you have available for that, allocate it based on maybe poverty index or something like with CBS, like we do with CDF, for instance, and then let the people decide who deserves, who is the most sort of in need, because they have social capital and they have information at the community level that the state doesn't have. The risk we run, and the instinct I'm finding with a lot of the people who want to understand this, is they're centralizing state-centric mindset. That they say, look, if you have money, ask people to organize themselves in a village. If you say the money is available for you is 500,000 shillings, give them. Don't ask questions. Don't tell them you must do this, follow these guidelines. They do these things all the time for themselves without the state. Yeah. So we have to think completely outside the box. But the thing I want to emphasize is that the Lifeline Fund is not just a welfare intervention sort of proposal. It's a macroeconomic stabilization instrument that is trying to work around the complication that the coronavirus brings, that its health imperative is the opposite of what we want to do in the economy. Now, the moratorium. The moratorium comes at the point where you ask, how do you finance it? Now, you already have an economic shock, and we know one of the things that's going to happen in this economic shock is that government revenue is going to fall. Two, we already know that we were running a deficit in the order of 7 to 8% of GDP. That's way over the line in terms of prudent deficit. And we've been doing this for several years. So we do not have the headroom, or fiscal space as we call it, to borrow and spend domestically. Yeah, we do not have that space. So what we can do, and what I've proposed we do, is one, you're not going to be able to do development projects anyway. So absorption will go down. So you can reallocate that money. Two, I see a lot of appeals, including by Prime Minister Abiy, and saying that the Western countries should advance Africa and other poor countries' credit lines. That system takes a long time. First of all, there's not enough money to go around. The IMF has said it has only $50 billion for the entire low and income countries. I did the math about how much you can get out of that. Not very much. But the debt service of issue creditors is money that we have already budgeted. And I should point out that I saw the IMF and the World Bank, or that bunch of people, IFIs, have actually sort of made the same call. I think their call came out on the same day or the day after my letter, my open letter. So there's many people are thinking, we are going to arrive at this conclusion anyway, that the quickest money available is diverting the money we would have used to pay official debt, to service official external debt, and use that money to cushion the economy, as well as to finance this lifeline fine sort of thing. So I hope that makes it a little more clear. But of course, some of the people who are challenging this are not challenging it because they don't agree, but it's because of who came up with it. I can see quite a number of people who are doing this for political purposes. And I think that's extremely cynical because we are talking about lives here. We're talking about the survival of the economy. Yeah, so just being politically cynical because you don't like the guy who came up with the idea, I think it's a very unethical and actually
very morbid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So quick one. Allow me to play the devil's advocate here. And worst case scenario, if say Corona hits us hard, our government is not able to manage this pandemic, both in terms of the health perspective, but also the political economy of it. How do citizens organize themselves politically, socially? How do we move on in that kind of context?
I actually think that in Africa, in particular, as I cannot speak for most or parts of it that I'm familiar with, is that we have a fair amount of social capital. If we go back to that tripod of Dr. Balakrishnan, which I really like, health systems, we don't have. Governance standards, bad. Social capital within communities, huge. But social capital between community and the state, touch and go in many countries. In Kenya, zero. Yeah, you've already seen the impact of this trying to implement a curfew last Friday, and instead of implementing a curfew, the police are out shaking down people and beating people up and all manner of things. The police-community relations in Kenya, they just sort of shown one of those weaknesses. I think for now, citizens have to organize socially and civically, regardless. Politically is another matter, and probably for later. I've already seen quite a few charitable responses, which are providing relief to informal settlement, and that's, of course, is a good thing. People always come out. We've seen this in other circumstances, bomb blasts, terrorist attacks. We've seen all these things. We're familiar with them, certainly in Kenya. But the biggest challenge, I think, if this crisis goes on for another couple of months, will not be generosity. I think people are generous, and they're Ubuntu as we call it. It's going to be scarcity. We may want, but given the severity of the economic disruption, particularly the urban sort of supply, the urban people who are much more dependent and exposed to market production and distribution. I think the real challenge is scarcity. So that even if you may have money or people who are willing to help, but they are not goods. That's the thing, I think, which is a big risk. So that's why, if you recall, I don't know whether you recall that at the very beginning, I started arguing, look, let us decongest the cities. We don't have the capacity to support the people in the informal settlements and all these kind of people. We don't have the infrastructure. But I still argue, unfortunately, I think we should have done that when we were still sure that we are ahead of the virus. Now, I don't know whether we are ahead of it or it's ahead of us. So that if we start thinking about decongesting, then really you are sort of exporting the virus to the rural areas. But I'm afraid even if the virus is now ahead of us, I think the only recourse for the urban vulnerable, if this sort of crisis stays longer, in the absence of a massive state intervention, is flight. And we've seen, I'm reading a lot of anecdotes from India, I saw one from Madagascar, all sorts of southern countries, that in fact, the mistake that the states trying to download the Western template of societies where everybody has the luxury of living either in a sort of separate house or in an apartment with a fair amount of space. That trying to download that template in our circumstances has probably cost us a lot of time. And what is happening is that people are breaking out of it because it doesn't make sense. And they're not going to get hungry. They're not going to starve in these crowded informal settlements or whatever in the towns. And if there's no social safety net. So they are doing, they're using, as you say, their community. They're tapping into the community safety net. The fact that quite a lot of us still consider cities as temporary abodes, and we still have homes where we either have houses or we have extended family that we can sort of would be able to retreat to. So that's where I think it will begin to play out. But again, we also have to organize and push back against what I see as opportunistic clawback of civil liberties in the guise of dealing with an emergency, as well as human rights violations. And I have already talked about police brutality, which is sort of the default of many of our states with a legacy of repressive regimes. So that is something which I think particularly the organized civil society has to be very, very, very vigilant, because you can see some of these people cynically even using this to suspend civil liberties. They've been trying to do it even before coronavirus. So now that they have this, it's a perfect excuse to do what. But I want to warn them that while they are preoccupied with trying to claw back power, this thing might come and bite them at the back. Eh? So they need to be careful.
Okay, which brings me to my last and final question before I let you go. I recognize that Africa is not homogeneous, but at least to a large extent, the last 500 years, political economy has been, more or less with very, very similar traits, from all the way from slavery, colonialism to neocolonialism. So what are some of the building blocks, if we were to talk about moving forward, a political economy that undergirds African flourishing? What are some of those building blocks that you could discuss?
Let me see whether I'm sure I understand the question. I think even if you can print the Africa with the same broad brush over the long haul, I still think that over the last 3 or 4 decades, 3 decades in particular, because of the way the world itself is changing, you're seeing very different trajectories. Even within Africa, countries on very, very different trajectories, I think. And that's because the world outside is also changing. I have argued, and I think this is part of it on a couple of occasions, that really what we have, these convulsions that we are observing, particularly since the end of the Cold War in the late 80s, early 90s, the global financial crisis, the political turbulence we are seeing in the West, and all these kind of things, we asked well powerful countries, the rise of China, and all manner of things. I see these actually as the end of imperialism, the sort of Western imperialism that began perhaps with slavery and began to end with what you call a sort of what you call post-industrial society, globalization, all these things. And of course, that means that even Africa now, you are going to see a lot more diversity if our sort of destiny is not being shaped by outsiders for their own interest. Because then if you take them out, Africa is a huge diverse place. So you're going to see as much diversity as the size of the continent and its population. Having said that, you will know that I've been at the forefront of, in the more immediacy of challenging the current international development flavor of the month, which is called the infrastructure-led growth, which I think is a complete oxymoron, which I call self-serving snake oil being sold by predatory capital. I am now increasingly looking at finance, global finance, what do you call financial capital, as the new extractive industry in Africa. Now they're no longer interested in minerals. They are interested in interest, as in high yield from high return on financial instruments. And I don't want to go into the details of that now. And these mega infrastructure investments, and is one of the key sort of instruments of trying to extract the surplus from the continent. The imperialism. I expect that this prognosis was already gaining currency as when we began to see debt distress so soon after HIPIC. We were forgiven debt the other day. Then we had Africa Rising. And then you ask, why is it that Africa Rising has quickly turned into Africa again in debt distress? And I think once we begin to see that is because that's the point you see, because there are people who have been trying to force feed us capital, both from the East and the West, but they're really looking for business. And they're looking for what the markets call hunting for yield, so that they can earn high returns for their pension funds, because obviously the returns in the economies have fallen and growth and productivity has fallen quite a bit. That's the sort of political economy dynamic. I think and hope that coronavirus will be the final nail in the coffin of this infrastructure-led growth, because people ask, what are our priorities? Is it social services, healthcare, welfare, sort of social safety nets? Or is it dams and Chinese railways and whatnot, and American power plants? Yeah, I think we are going to now be able to have that conversation in a much more sober environment. The people who have been telling us that infrastructure is the next best thing after sliced bread are going to have a bit of a hard time selling that gospel after this, because this is quite a big shock. I also think and hope that as this thing Dr. Balakrishnan called the acid test unfold, we will reflect on our intellectual and cultural dependency on foreign development ideas. Yeah. Now I'm going to my hobby horses. I have to sort of, in the interest of disclosure, we begin to see this happening after the global financial crisis, because many people who have been looking up to the West for money, for ideas, for everything, could not contemplate that they could see the mighty former colonial masters confronting a crisis of that magnitude themselves, and not being able to deal with it as well as some might have thought they would. Again, the coronavirus is exposing that nobody is really that developed. Yeah, against forces of nature, for instance. Yeah, we've been hearing. I remember reading not too long ago a very sort of scaring paper. I think it was in Nature or something else, either in Nature or one of these sort of natural history journals, talking about the risk of pathogens which have been frozen in the permafrost and the ice caps since the Middle Ages, coming back to life as the globe warms. I think those are the sort of apocalyptic scenarios that we are looking at. We have seen that nobody is really more developed on those things than anybody else, and we are all equally vulnerable. So we will all have to sit around a table and talk about these things. We will have to talk with the Chinese. I hate to say this. We will have to talk about Chinese, about illegal wildlife trade. If it turns out that this virus jumped to people from either bats, it has also been likened to I think a virus found in pangolins and all these things. I think that's a conversation we are going to have. So there are quite a number of conversations we are going to have of that nature. Finally, the medical prognosis of this thing are telling us that it's people who have underlying medical conditions. I have learned the phrase comorbidities. That's what they're being called. It's people who have underlying medical conditions who are most at risk. Yeah. And I think it's the same with societies. So there are societies, each society has its comorbidities, underlying sort of societal comorbidities. We highlighted the US ones, and I don't want to go back there. But I think from our perspective here is the governance-related ones, the governance-related comorbidities or underlying conditions, corruption, ineffective states for various reasons. Those are going to prove to be the most critical points of failure. If, and I hope this doesn't come to pass, we see an elevated sort of infection rate in this part of the world. If that happens, I think the thing which is really going to undermine our capacity to respond might actually not going to be healthcare systems as bad as they are. It is not going to be, I think, social capital. Certainly social capital in the community is probably what's going to have our biggest strength. It's the governance failures. I think corruption, the ineffective states, and the low social capital, the low trust between the state and the people, which we've already seen playing out. You saw that in Mombasa, the Likoni ferry. That's what's going to be the big. And if then that happens, I think the political blowback on our political class after that will be huge. That's how I see it. So this, I think, yes, I agree with you. There's going to be the world before and the world after Corona, even in our politics.
Oh, I like that ending. There'll be a world before and a world after, even in our politics.
Dr.
Ndii, thank you so much for this experiment. You know, as we said, we're experimenting. We're moving to the world after Corona. So we're experimenting. Even these new media platforms for the audience. Yeah, for the audience watching us, the next, as I said earlier, for the next coming days, months, as long as this Corona continues, we shall be having conversations with concerned citizens on matters on the causes, effects, and possible futures after Corona. Dr. David.Ndii, asante sana.
Asante sana, Joe. I hope this worked.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it definitely will. I mean, let's see how it plays out.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Okay. And all the best. Stay safe.
Okay. You too, sir.
All right.